Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Jean-Do Massaero, an Alexander Technique teacher in Montpellier, France. We've been doing a series of conversations about the influence of Delsarte, and even more specifically, Delsarte's younger brother Camille Delsarte, on F. Matthias Alexander and what's become known as the Alexander Technique. And we're going to continue that discussion. Jean-Do, welcome once again.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. It's a pleasure to talk to you again. What I'd like to do is just very briefly try to summarize the big picture of where we are at so far in these conversations. That it seems pretty clear that there was a strong Delsarte method influence on F. Matthias Alexander, coming by way of Francois Delsarte's younger brother Camille, who moved to Australia in, I believe you said it was 1851. We had the date wrong earlier.
Yes, I
Uh,
made a mistake. It was not 1857, as I said.
yeah.
I checked, and it's 1851. He entered Australia through Adelaide, and it was in 51. Yes.
Right, and he spent a lot of the time until his death in 1887 in, of all places, Tasmania. There's even a building in Hobart. He was in Hobart. He was quite well known as a teacher of voice teacher, drama teacher, and so on. And he had a huge influence on a lot of not Australian, the acting community, and that certainly permeated to Alexander, who we know held himself out as a teacher of the Delsarte method before moving to England. And the If I can just summarize what you said about Camille's influence,
Yeah.
indirect influence, Camille represented a kind of an early stage of Francois Delsarte's teaching, and did not. He did use the images that Delsarte used, but
Yes.
he wasn't as skilled at drawing them as Francois was, and it doesn't appear that Alexander ever used them himself. Does that sound right?
Yes, it
He,
is right from my knowledge.
from
Yes.
what we know, but certainly the some of the underlying ideas of Francois Delsarte were very strongly embedded in Alexander's initial work on himself and on his teaching, and that we know that for a long time Alexander did not use his hands to help students. That ended somewhere, maybe in the teens, maybe in the mid 20s, but that he relied pretty much entirely on verbal instructions. Is that fair to say as well?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. There is one thing that we can mention is the fact, for example, that um, his niece, Alexander's niece,
Mm-hmm.
with Marjorie Barlow,
Mm-hmm.
she wrote down that his Alexander's brother, A.R. Redden, he was in fact always saying that Alexander never laid a hand on him.
Mm-hmm.
So
And you said you had some a record of Alexander's teaching around 1914 or so, description of him teaching, and there was no hands-on work there
exactly,
either.
yes,
So
yes,
hands-on is a, came quite a bit later than the original years of teaching.
yes, exactly.
And in connection with that, I know that you wanted to talk a little about Alexander's use of the term position.
Yeah.
Um, maybe it's not directly related to hands-on or not hands-on, but I believe it is related to this early period of first part of Alexander's teaching. And I've always been puzzled by the photographs that appear in the back of MSI, Man's Supreme Inheritance,
Yes.
that show, as he puts it, the correct and the incorrect position of obtaining perfect equilibrium of the human machine when standing.
Yeah.
And it involves very specific instructions of where the feet should go.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I do remember Marjorie Barstow once talking about that kind of in passing.
I'm interested there.
Yeah, it's on her video. It's in a video done in Australia. She just kind of went off on that a little bit, and it was sort of out of nowhere, and it certainly isn't something she particularly talked about a lot. But the idea was that you would have one foot a bit in front of the other and turned out at a roughly 45-degree angle, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is your take on this interest in positions, and did you think he went wrong there, or what's your take on that?
Well, there are many things to say here, so I will have to be quite organized in answering the question. I think there are three things that I want to say. The first thing, when we talk about this picture, I invite everybody to go back to Man's Supreme Inheritance and to watch them, because there is something astonishing, really, really astonishing, is that if you look at the photograph, you will see there is no neck. There is no head.
Right, it's cut off. Right.
Yeah, it's cut off. Yes. Did you ever wonder why it's cut off?
I didn't wonder so much about that, but I wondered why he had separate pictures for a woman wearing a long dress.
Yes, but it's quite interesting that the relationship between the torso and the head is not featured in the photographs.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a time when the real center of interest was the torso.
Mm-hmm. And that fits in with Delsarte's ideas too.
Absolutely,
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. You will see. You will follow me. You're going too fast. You're
Okay,
not following me. You're going ahead of me.
I'm going to step back here.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's just to say that when you read Alexander, for example, the first two books, Man's Supreme Inheritance and Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual, this is where you find the biggest similarities between Alexander and Delsarte. Mm-hmm. It's there. It's not through comments or reading of a lesson at that age or that time or another time. No, it's because I followed words by words what Alexander was saying. So I have to come back to the term position because before I make any more comment about the photograph. Try and follow me. You will see. So when Alexander is talking about positions in the first two books, there is something very strange, is that he's talking about position in walking, in going up and down the stairs, he's talking about positions. Well, for me, he's talking about movements. Mm-hmm. It's as if he's talking about a still image of a movement. Mm-hmm. You have to understand that we are talking about movements here. That is that when you see somebody during a walk, for example, with a still image, you know that the whole structure is in movement and that the parts are moving relative to one another. It's not a posture in a sense of a fixed thing. You understand the idea? For example, one of the main concepts or fundamental principles of the Delsarte teaching is said that you have to strengthen the center, which is the torso, and you have to free the circumference, which is the head and limbs. Mm-hmm. That is considered as the fundamental principle.
Of Delsarte's teaching.
Of Delsarte teaching, yes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But then, when Alexander describes the first time what he called the position of mechanical advantage, so we get the word position here again. So you might think that we are talking about a fixed position, a fixed posture that would be good. Yes, but you have to understand that this appears in a paragraph about scoliosis, about undue shortening of the spine. And Alexander says, well, this undue shortening of the spine is not due because of undue action of the muscle shortening. No, it's not due. It's the reason of the position, the abnormal shortening of the spine is due to the muscles that are intended by nature to produce a force, and they are not producing it. Though the whole technique is about, in fact, using a position of mechanical advantage in order to bring these muscles back into function. It's very clear. You are not to try to strengthen them by exercise. You're not to try to release the muscles that are too short. You are to bring back the released muscle into function. And in order to achieve that, you have to use what they call position of mechanical advantage. But then you realize that he's not talking about a position. And especially if you read Delsarte, as I had the chance to do because I'm French, the first step toward getting the mind under control is to acquire freedom of the joints. It's a very interesting sentence, this. It's that we are not talking about getting the body under control, under conscious control. It's the mind that we are trying to control here.
And this is Delsarte saying this again.
Yes, I'm mixing. Sorry, this is Delsarte.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And there is a second quote that I need to bring in before to wrap the thing in order to answer completely. There is a quote from one of the founder of modern dance, modern American dance. He's called Ted Shawn. He's a very, very famous dancer and producer in the States. And this man states in his book, Every Little Movement it's called, and he states, one, the absolutely vital differences of the Delsarte teaching is the recognition of the torso as a source and essential means of a true emotional expression through gestures. It means that you have to understand something. It's the way you move the different parts of the torso in front of an audience is going to convey an emotional situation that, of course, is not there because you're not emotionally involved. You're an actor.
And he's talking about moving parts of your torso relative to each other.
Yes.
Sort of internal torso movements.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And these internal torso movements, if you organize them in opposition one to the next, then you get what we call the lengthening of the torso. It's a geometrical problem we're talking about here. You have different pieces of support that are set at an angle, and you want to have them straightened. Alexander used the term straighten the spine. It's unfortunate, but it's conveying something. That if you've got some parts that are unduly arched, what you need is to change the geometry of the different parts that are not correctly adjusted. So we are talking here about adjustment of bones, of levers. These adjustments of bones are necessary because the person has habits of movements of these parts that are subconscious. The person is not even aware that she's moving one part against the other all the time, but that's what we do. And so Delsarte proposes not a position, as Alexander would call it, I rather like another word. I use geometry because geometry is a language that is used to understand the different position of rigid structures. And we are talking about not muscles that are so delicate and so complex and so different in their shape all the time. We are talking about bones. It's much easier. And when you are in front of a mirror, for example, and you spend a lot of time in front of the mirror projecting orders,
Mm-hmm.
you are not concerned about muscles because the muscle they are not making the shape of the whole self. It's the bones. It's the different position of the bones that make the spine be lengthening or not lengthening. So there are very, very clear indications that the directions are not directions for changing the way the musculature is activated or not activated. It's about changing the geometry. Because if you change the geometry, Alexander says that the muscles that are unduly relaxed all the time and allow for the shortening, these muscles are to be brought back into play. This is Alexander in 1909.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could hear Delsarte speaking here.
Mm-hmm. And was the method of doing this, or part of the method of accomplishing this, placing yourself in this position of mechanical advantage? Just the position and freeing the joints will facilitate that change? Is that the idea?
Well, in fact, the problem is even more complex because you need to free the joint in order to elicit movement between the different parts of the torso before you start to coordinate these different movements to create the geometry you want.
Mm-hmm.
The first problem in the Delsarte system is called decomposition.
Mm-hmm.
And decomposition means freeing the joints between the different parts you're talking about. You have to create movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's directions for movement. So you have to, in fact, remember Delsarte in front of the mirror, wanting to create the movement of the larynx downward.
Mm-hmm.
When
Mm-hmm.
he was singing high notes,
Right.
he wanted to see a movements, and he couldn't feel any urge, any possibility of moving the larynx that way. It
Mm-hmm.
seemed impossible. And then the big surprise was to discover that by thinking the movement, he started to realize that there was some movement happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I'm all against magic, but it's that is the magic moment.
Well,
That is
it sounds a lot like direction, doesn't it?
well,
Like
yeah.
Alexander technique direction, but before Alexander.
Yes, but it's in front of the mirror and you
Mm-hmm.
are checking
Mm-hmm.
that you are really, when we say, we use the term projecting, or Alexander at the time used the term projecting directions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you have to finish that sentence in the Delsarte way, because Delsarte would say you project direction to your reflection. You project direction because you're seeing an image in front of you. It happens to be your reflection. You see yourself in front of you,
Mm-hmm.
and you will the movement of a part that resists, that doesn't want to go the way you will it. It wants to go the way of your habit.
Mm-hmm.
And then you discover that by that very strange detached position that you get, that your feeling doesn't count, that all that counts is the reflection, the moment of the reflection, and then suddenly something happens, and then some movement start to be possible. So, and you will discover that these movements are absolutely different or alien to what you feel you
Mm-hmm.
should be doing in order to get these movements.
So
So
if he was using a mirror not just in the way, or maybe not in the way Alexander says he did, to get kind of unbiased feedback about what he was doing, with his head and neck and so on. But Delsarte was using the mirror as a way of directing himself indirectly by directing the image in the mirror, getting around his debauched kinesthetic awareness, so to speak.
I couldn't say it better.
Ah, wow. Well, I'm just picking up on what you're saying here. It seems like an amazing process, really. But Alexander didn't go that route.
No, I think he did.
Oh,
That's the problem. I really
but I
do
mean, he
think he
didn't
did.
use them. He didn't have this idea of directing the image in the mirror, right?
Well,
Or did he? I don't know.
I don't. I'm a very difficult position because we should ask Alexander, but he's dead, so there is a problem here. But when you read the first two books in detail, as I've done, and you check and you comment on every sentence you find, and you try to make sense of the whole thing, then you realize that he knew a lot about the Delsarte system. He knew absolutely about directing in front of the mirror. He knew the word projecting direction.
Okay, so he did that for himself, presumably.
Oh, I'm absolutely
You're sure of
certain
that?
he did.
But
Yeah.
but we don't. There's doesn't seem, as far as I know, any Alexander technique tradition of standing in front of a mirror and and directing the image on the mirror. Maybe there is in some schools. I've never heard of it.
I've never heard of it too, but what my teacher would say, well, you should read Evolution of a Technique. It's
Uh-huh.
the first chapter of the use of the self. And what do we get in the first chapter of the use of the self? Not one, but repeated reference to the fact that he should check in the mirror what he was projecting, because he discovered that although he had worked on himself for quite a long while at the
Uh-huh.
end of evolution, he realized that he still was trying to, in fact, check what he was doing according to what he felt. And he said, but stupid me,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
need to go in front of the mirror again. And that's the only way I can get proof that I'm really inhibiting when I think and I'm inhibiting. Well, you see, all that. That is the essence of our technique. Well, that's what my teacher told me. He said, well, if you want to understand the technique, you have to read Evolution of a Technique.
But he doesn't say, as far as I can remember in that chapter, that he directed his image in the mirror. My sense is always that the mirror, the clever thing that Alexander figured out was that the mirror, especially a side angle or a back angle,
Yeah.
would give him kind of unbiased, correct information. In other words, it would be a much more reliable indication of what he was actually doing than anything else he had available to him.
Yes, that's
But
absolutely
that's
correct.
not quite the same as saying he was directing his image.
I'm sorry, sir. I disagree. I will
Okay.
explain. I will
Okay.
explain.
All right.
You said it was a means to make sure of what he was really doing. Is that
Right.
correct?
Yep.
Yes. Is that not directing?
Well, he's direct so he sees he's doing something he thought he wasn't doing, and he goes back and my
Yeah.
sense is he goes back and figures out maybe I have to change the way I direct or not get caught up in my feelings. I guess my idea of directing the image is when you would just stand in front of the mirror and tell that image what to do, which sounds like what Delsarte was doing.
It's
Or,
again,
or we
I
don't know.
disagree. I will try to explain.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's a difficult thing because for me it was quite clear that when you're reasoning about how to produce a given relation between parts, a given geometry or given position, as you want to call it, and you are checking in the mirror that in fact you are not succeeding, you are not in fact producing or projecting the image you want, then you will reason in your mind and decide to project the direction differently. That's what I call projecting direction in a mirror.
So you would do that. You would do that retry, as it were, in real time getting visual feedback.
Of course.
Okay,
And you
so
will,
yeah, okay. So
because
you're
you
so
would,
yeah.
you get two things. You get visual feedback, but
Uh-huh.
you get something else at the same time. You get a bonus. The bonus you get is how wrong you do have to feel in order to produce the projection you want.
You learn to be okay with feeling wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But
That,
so but
that's immediate.
but he yeah, I guess that's not something I would have ever picked up from that chapter in Use of the Self. I saw it as kind of, as I said, a place. He would discover he wasn't doing what he thought he was doing, and so he would go back and then try a different process, and then eventually, what he did see matched what he did, and then he was happy.
Hmm.
But the description you're giving is more a real time thing. He's changing it as he's watching himself, and
Well,
that's the
remember,
part
yes,
that's new to me.
what he was saying was that he, in fact, directed and then checked and discovered that he hadn't inhibited what he thought he had inhibited.
And
Yeah,
did he ever teach his students to do that?
that I do not know. I do not know. But he certainly talks about it as if he did in the use of the self. He apparently is very aware of the problem of projecting direction to the reflection.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, that's problematic because in his writing, he's so aware of it. He's so clear about his, and that is 30 or maybe 40 years after the deed, because he wrote about the evolution of the technique in 1930 something,
Early 30s.
early 30s.
Yeah.
So, and that happened in 1893.
But yet today, this I think this would come as news to most Alexander teachers.
No, everybody knows that he was checking in the mirror all the
No, the
time.
mirror, but this way of using the mirror, projecting the image, directing the image in the
Oh
mirror.
yeah. Oh, let me say something of a personal nature.
Sure. Go.
I translated Alexander books into French, and in fact, it's quite a strange position to be in because I was a new student. I was not an Alexander teacher when I started. I started that as a school project. You
Mm-hmm.
understand?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very strange because I had to know quite a lot of what Alexander had said or had written, while my teacher knew a lot more about the practical techniques than I did.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? It was a
Sure.
strange situation. Okay. Um, what is interesting in this position of a translator, it at some point the guy starts to speak to you because you spend so much time translating. It's an enormous amounts of hours that you have to spend, in that thing. You alone with the text. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a moment when you start to need a sort of reference to the real world,
Right.
and not speak like Alexander was speaking, and not think like Alexander was thinking. So there is one way is to listen to the guy that is reading the book. Well, I listened to Alexander's words, and I experimented.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Instead of
Okay.
staying on an academic level and saying, well, I will translate this sentence like this, I
Mm-hmm.
am standing in front of the mirror to check that the direction was good. No, it's not. Then you go in front of a mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it was very strange because there was some fear of the mirror in the school I was in.
Mm-hmm.
There was no, there was, you imagine mirrors everywhere. No, no,
Mm-hmm.
no. There were none.
Mm.
There were no mirrors. The teachers
Wow.
were the mirrors,
Really?
if you want,
Uh-huh.
but there were no mirrors. And there was no. What I had to construct is, a two-way mirror so that you can see yourself from the three-quarter an angle and also from the back, from the side, so that you can see how your back is behaving. I had to
Yeah.
construct that at home
Right. Oh,
because
okay.
it was nothing like this. So in school, we were very far from evolution of a technique, in a sense. in a practical sense, you know. So
Hmm.
because I was translating the book, I had to recreate that. So I could see that projecting directions could be checked in a mirror, and you project a direction in a mirror, and you can evaluate straight away that your projection is a bit tainted by your sensory appreciation, and
Hmm.
that if you want to achieve what the guy is saying that you must, then you discover that wow, the feeling you get from that move is horrendous.
So this, I earlier on, you mentioned to me, it might have been not during an actual podcast, but that while Alexander, I think the way you phrased it was that it's all there in his books, but you've got to really be on the lookout for it, sort of
Yeah.
how to direct. And this, I think this was a discussion, maybe the idea that, okay, Alexander was strongly influenced by Delsarte's ideas, but we shouldn't in any way take that as any sort of condemnation of Alexander. In fact, from my point of view, that's actually a very positive thing. But it isn't that he stole something, he was influenced by something and he took it in a really good direction, right?
And you take it higher. And if
Took
you
it to a better
compare,
place. And
yeah,
as you
to
say,
better,
he was
yeah,
probably the best Delsartean around.
exactly. Well,
Yeah.
he was by. It's incredible how much better he was because when you read the books of the Delsartist, it's like appalling.
Right.
It's
Well,
like all about relaxation, about
right.
releasing, and there is you can't get nothing out of Delsartism of really really little things. Well, when you read Alexander's books, wow! I think I mentioned it to you. I consider it a gold mine. Of course, you have to dig in order to get the ore, but
Hmm.
it's a real gold mine that Alexander has left us. I I've always been fond of these books, you know, but
Hmm.
when translating them, suddenly it was like, wow, but it's shining everywhere. As soon as you try and pass the difficult language and to try to engage into what he's talking about, well, trying and getting the mirrors and trying to direct, wow, suddenly you think, wow, but this guy is talking real stuff, and
Yeah.
it's amazing the invention and the insights and how well also how correct is always about the biomechanical arrangement of the different parts. It's
Hmm.
absolutely incredible. So no, I'm not belittling Alexander, not at all. For
Right.
me, is the master because what happened is that Delsarte stopped teaching the practical part of his system. He
Right.
stayed in the mystical and in the theoretical,
Right.
uh, uh, well, upper layer of his technique that is not very interesting to me. But what Alexander did is, well, transform the life of the student.
So,
That's
so
amazing.
if it's okay with you, I'd like to end this conversation just for because of time constraints,
Yes?
and
Yeah?
then can talk a little more about this whole period of time and what it means for Alexander students and teachers today in a second podcast. Is that okay?
Yes? That's
So,
absolutely fine.
so my guest today has been Jando Massaero, an Alexander Technique teacher in Montpellier, France, and we're going to have some more conversations in this series shortly. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you.